I'm Heidi Otway, your host for this Conversations on Cannabis virtual forum brought to you by the Medical Marijuana Education and Research Initiative at Florida A&M University. In this conversation, we're talking about the federal process to reclassify marijuana as a less dangerous drug, where it stands now, and the potential impact to the public if this occurs. So let's talk and learn about this subject with our guests. Greg Henderson is recognized as one of the leading experts in the federal drug and alcohol industry. He's overseen drug programs for federal agencies, including the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the Department of Homeland Security. Greg, welcome to the forum. Tell us more about yourself.
All right, thanks for having me, Heidi. First of all, I'm excited that you guys are touching on this subject. I told my colleagues that I'll be doing this type of platform, and they're excited that the conversation is continuing. So they wanted me to say thank you to FAMU for hosting this type of entity.
Good. I'm so looking forward to you sharing more about your expertise and experience. It's going to be really awesome.
Yeah. So I'm currently the owner and founder of Federal Drug Testing Services, where as a former FAA compliance inspector, I went out and started my own company where I do consulting to major airlines and all entities that fall under aviation regulations for drug and alcohol testing. And I also have the only two accredited courses that teaches them how to understand FAA drug and alcohol compliances, and the only course that is a drug and alcohol program manager course for HHS. So I literally teach the federal employees who run those drug programs how to understand their guidelines and regulations as well.
Wow, that is fascinating. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank
Our
you.
other guest is Mark Maxim. He is a leader in the drug and alcohol testing industry as well. For nearly 30 years, he's gained extensive expertise in the field of drug and alcohol screening and compliance. Mark, welcome back to the forum. Tell us more about yourself.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I'm happy to be here and happy to be part of this important conversation, help people learn and understand what this means and what it's really potentially going to look like for us. As most individuals don't know, I got my start in drug and alcohol testing after leaving law enforcement, and been involved for 28 years, and I'm currently the chairman-elect for the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association, the largest trade association with almost 6,000 members, and advocating for education and understanding, as well as drug and alcohol testing policies and compliance for our entire nation. And so it's an honor to be here, and thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have both of you on this show. And to everyone who is joining us on this live program, please share, post, and tag a friend on Facebook to have them join this conversation. If you're on YouTube, share the link so others can join us as well. During the forum, we want you to send us your questions in the comment box, and we'll do our best to have our guests answer them. We also want you to tell us what you think about this forum by completing the survey that will be posted in the comments on YouTube and Facebook after the live program. Your name will be entered into a drawing on August 6th, 2024 to win a $100 gift card provided by one of Mary's partners. Now, let's start this conversation on cannabis. So right now, the U.S. Department of Justice is in the process of reclassifying marijuana as a less dangerous drug. So I want to start this conversation by explaining what it means to reclassify a drug. Mark, can you give our viewers and listeners an overview of that, please?
Sure. So, as a lot of folks have heard and been reading and hearing in the news, the Biden administration asked the Health and Human Services and the Attorney General, who oversee the Drug Enforcement Agency, to review marijuana as far as its classification. Marijuana currently is a Schedule 1. And they have made the proposal to make it a Schedule 3. Now, if made a Schedule 3, it will not legalize recreational cannabis nationwide. Instead, it is simply going to create an actual mechanism, if you will, to where you'll be allowed to use it if you have the appropriate permissions and or recommendations, similar to that of a prescription. It's not going to make it a prescription because, again, we all know that in order to be a prescribed drug, the FDA has to approve it. Mm-hmm. And so it simply means that they're going to classify it as not being as dangerous or not be as a cause for severe addiction, as the Health and Human Services Department reported to the administration. So that is really what it will mean. What is it going to look like? I think we're in a wait and see. We're not quite sure where we're at, and as that process continues to flow as it's supposed to, I think that there's going to be a lot of things that are unknown and going to have to be identified. Decisions will have to be made and everything as far as what kind of an impact it's going to have, both economically, medically, as well.
Yeah. Greg, was there anything more you wanted to add to that? I'm curious to maybe let our viewers and listeners know what drugs are currently in Schedule 1 and then maybe what drugs are in Schedule 3 so they can have that comparison to where marijuana is now and where the federal government is trying to reclassify it to be.
Gotcha. So when we talk about the different schedules, I think that is a great question because the average person, unless they go Google it, really have no idea what any of this means. So Schedule 3, if we think about like anything under like 90 milligrams of codeine per dosage, right? Like Tylenol with codeine or anabolic steroids, those type of things, testosterone, those things will fall in like a Schedule 3.
Okay.
Right? So it's saying that there is some effects, because we know codeine, Tylenol has some effects to it, right? So, but when you start talking about Schedule 1 means that there is no safe place for any of these drugs in society. So right now, that's where marijuana is when we talk about all the drugs that the feds are testing for: THC, cocaine, PCP, opioids, amphetamines, but there's subcategories of those things, right? Like amphetamines, you have ADHD medication and stuff like that. But however, you need to be on prescription for those particular type of drugs. And when you get into PCP, LSD, there's no prescription for those type of drugs, and those are your Schedule 1, and that's where marijuana currently is.
Wow. So let's talk about this process that they're going through right now at the federal level to reclassify marijuana. Mark, you want to maybe walk us through, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what is the process?
Sure. So essentially what started the process was obviously the Department of Justice came out with a notice of proposed rule where they want to reclassify. So they outline that in a docket, 92 pages long, essentially outlining what they were going to propose. And they sent it out. Essentially, whenever there is a proposed rule, we as United States citizens get notified and are provided an opportunity to comment. And our comments are then gathered. That comment period goes for a certain length of time. So in this particular case, the comment period was 60 days from the notice. So the notice came out back in May, and the comment period ended at 11:59 p.m. last night. The comment period ended, and the comments were gathered. There are approximately 42,925 comments that were placed up there. And now what happens is they have to go and they have to read every comment. they have to categorize it, they have to place it, and they have to review it, and they have to consider the comments. From there, they will then take it back and they'll analyze all of those comments, and they will then make a decision to either make changes to the proposed rule that they're wanting to do, or they may choose to rewrite it altogether. There's any number of things that could happen, at which point they will then place out a notice of final rulemaking. And at that point, there will be another comment period. As well, affording us the ability to place our comments. Okay, but generally, the notice of final rulemaking is really the final rule. They're going to place it out there, and the comments may or may not have any effect. And that rule will then go into place on the given day that they actually state the date, the effective date. So it's a process, but it's going to be a long process, because during this process, not only were comments allowed, but it was also allowed to request a hearing before an administrative judge on the process and on the actual factual and science-based information that should be provided. So that is another part of the process where the hearing can be granted or denied. And then the hearing would have to be scheduled. The process would then go through, and the appropriate parties would present themselves in Washington before that hearing and have their voices heard before any other formal decisions will be made. So that's really kind of the process as we know it and as we see it. And so it's going to be interesting to see how things evolve over the next several weeks and months, I believe.
Yeah, I find it interesting. And Greg, I'm going to look to you to kind of give me some insights on this. But we have, over 300 million people in the United States, and we're seeing cannabis and marijuana, medical marijuana, and recreational become more mainstream. So given your experience and your work at the federal level, are you surprised that we had a little more than 42,000 people respond to this opportunity to weigh in on this?
No, actually, I'm excited that 42,000 people actually showed up to make comments.
Okay.
And here's the reason, Heidi, and Mark can attest to this, is when this stuff gets put out, it's put out in the language that the average person doesn't pay attention to. It's not on your local news channels. It's not broken down in layman's term. And what I mean by that is that they use language like, a hearing, and if you want to participate in a hearing pursuant to 21 CFR 1308.44 in accordance with 21 CFR, whatever. And then we want you to go to a federal e-ruling portal to make your comments and such. It's like the average person is not paying attention to that language. So if it's put out in common terms on the news channels and whatever, where people can actually say, hey, we're going to have this discussion about the reclassification of marijuana and educate the people on what this actually is and break it down to the lowest common denominator, then we may have 1 million people making comments and so forth. But of those 40,000 people, that is not most of them are not your average person. Like, you cannot go to 10 people in your neighborhood and ask them, do they know anything about this reclassification of marijuana? And if they do, they just heard it in passing because they probably smoke weed themselves. Like, it's just the language and how it's being put out. I was, matter of fact, I was given a class to a major airline about 3 weeks ago, and nobody in there, and these are all people who are drug program people at major airlines, and none of them knew about the comment section. I had to actually email them the link to go ahead and make comments. So I know personally that it is not being spread out, to the vast audience. Even Mark could tell you when we were in Hershey, the people who are speaking at Hershey had to get up and remind people to go and make comments because it's not being put out there the way that it should be put out there.
Mm-hmm. Mark, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Greg has a great point. I think that, for the common individual out there, they don't understand some of the terms and the language that's being spoken. And a lot of times when they don't understand, they don't believe that it's maybe important enough, or they don't know what it actually means. So I think that, we as individuals and professionals need to try and do a better job at reaching our population and helping them to understand, put things in layman's terms that people can understand and base their feelings on the information once they have a clear understanding of it. And it's so surprising that in general conversations, and you bring this up, some people don't find it to be important at all. And that doesn't mean that they are for or against. They're just indifferent and they don't have an opinion. And they really, I think sometimes once they better understand what the actual implications look like, that's when they become actually engaged, and they then want to be part of the conversation once they have an understanding.
Well, I think that's a great segue into us kind of explaining how reclassification of marijuana could impact the public. So let's kind of dive into that part of our conversation. And one of the things that, I've been hearing a lot of is that if this is passed, whenever it is, if it does or not, if it is, it will impact what are called safety sensitive positions. So can you all talk a little bit about that? Define what a safety sensitive position is and what it would mean if cannabis or marijuana is reclassified as a less dangerous drug. Greg, you want to?
Well, when we talk about safety sensitive positions, but before we move on to that, Heidi, I kind of wanted to go back to what we were talking about, and then I can answer that question for you when we're talking about the 42,000 people.
Yeah.
I know when we were off air, you were talking about who are these 42,000 people, whatever. So this will give you an idea of what me and Mark are talking about. Is like it's the governors, the members of Congress, medical professionals, the advocacy groups for whichever side they're on, and some coalition reform groups. These are the ones who are actually sending in comments, right?
Okay.
I just wanted to kind of give a little bit more deeper understanding of that. So hopefully this platform will get a little more information out there so that when they do have this revisiting of this, that people will take this a little more, to heart and go and make comments that we can, branch off beyond the professionals and the advocacy groups and see what the public actually is saying.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
So that segues into what we're talking about as far as safety sensitive position goes. Safety sensitive positions is normally a title that is put under Department of Transportation, the different modes of transportation. So when we're talking about air, land, and sea, and rail, just for the common understanding, these agencies like federal trucking, which is federal motor carrier, these are all your semi trucks drivers who are out there on your highways, doing the transportation, your federal railway, your federal transit, which is your busing, your system, your pipeline and hazardous, people out there in the oil fields, right? And then you have the Federal Aviation Administration, which is your air. And then you have the United States Coast Guard, which people kind of think is military, but they're not. They fall up under the Department of Homeland Security. So you have these different entities, and each one of them have safety sensitive positions in them. So there's different categories, and I would say that the FAA has more safety sensitive positions than all the other ones. They have 9. But we're talking about your pilots and your mechanics and your air traffic controllers, right? And you get into your ground security coordinators and things of that nature, and your your Amtrak trains, and all of these entities, Federal Transit, which is your school bus, right, where your kids are on, and those are what we consider to be safety sensitive positions.
And in those safety sensitive positions, they have to be regularly drug tested under the current classification of cannabis. You want to talk a little bit about that? You and Mark talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, yeah, I'll start, Greg. So safety sensitive position, I mean, if we look at it, the meaning or what it is defined as, it's a job wherein an accident could cause loss of human life or serious bodily injury or significant property or environmental damage. So all of those positions would be considered to be safety sensitive that Greg mentioned. And under the current guidelines, if we talk about the history, there was a couple of train derailments back in the 1980s. And the most famous one is the Chase, Maryland incident of 1987, where a actual passenger train derailed and ended up killing a number of individuals as well as injuring hundreds of others. And it was actually discovered that the train conductor was high on cannabis.
Wow.
So out of those serious incidents came about the executive order back when President Ronald Reagan signed the executive order. And thus out of that created the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act, known as OTETA. And that's really when drug testing started. And how it really came about is that they essentially said, okay, the Drug Enforcement Administration would advise Health and Human Services on the actual substances that are going to be tested for. And back at that time, they called them the National Institute on Drug Abuse, okay, which we now know it to be the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And at that time, they came out with the 5 drugs that are going to be tested for. And they classified those from being under Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. Okay, those drugs were dangerous drugs. And so those were the classifications that were used. And so as it's defined for us, those are the only drugs that are allowed to be tested for under the federal programs. So Health and Human Services is where it actually was laid out. And from there, the Department of Transportation then follows along. Okay. And so they adopt those same things, kind of similarly to they take their direction from the Health and Human Services Department.
Okay.
So under the current language, the proposal doesn't have any language referencing a safety carve out or providing the ability for any of the safety sensitive positions to be able to test for cannabis. So if the reclassification happens under the current language, we individuals who provide testing to the Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services, federal programs will not be able to test for cannabis. That's what it really has as far as one of the implications that it has on us.
Okay. Greg, who's working to address this?
Me, Mark, Indesa, Sapa, you have those individuals. Heidi, the thing about this is that we educate. This is what we do. We train, and we have reasonable suspicion courses where people have to learn the behavior cues of said someone being under the influence of something. So we look at things more from the the safety output of it and what these things could potentially do.
Yeah.
We're all for the medical healing of it, but the other side of it, we see this daily, in our activities, the outcome.
Mark, anything you'd like to add to that?
I mean, when we talk about the implications that we might see out there, I mean, obviously, everyone wants to have their own opinion, and I think that there's going to create many different aspects that have to be considered. The research that's going to need to go in and try to determine, what medical purpose will this have, and what does the science show, and how do you regulate that? What's the economic impact going to have? What's the impact going to be on individuals that were sentenced to prison and are in prison for marijuana offenses now that over 38 states have some form of legalized medical marijuana or recreational within their state? What is that going to look like? I think there's so many different parts of this that we look at, but as Greg said, there's a mechanism in place for safety and the need to protect safety. And I think that really, if we aren't going to protect safety, we're going to go backwards rather than forward. And we need to make sure that that is right up front and part of the conversation. So it is highly considered and highly understood. And, there's a number of research studies out there that I think need to be shared, that people need to better understand what this could mean.
Yeah. So, Mark, after the show, if you could share that with us, we can definitely post it on Mary's social media to allow folks to kind of dig into that information and check
Well,
that
Heidi,
out.
let me add to that what Mark was saying, just to give you guys an idea of what this means. Just put in perspective of the safety sensitive positions we talked about earlier. And I'm going to give you some things to think about. So in some of the research, we showed that marijuana affects timing, movement, and coordination. So if it affects these things, and we're talking about safety sensitive positions now, right? Our pilots driving these planes, our truckers on the road, right? People who are driving under the influence, marijuana can experience dangerous effects like slow reaction, lane weaving, decreased coordination, and difficulty reacting to signals and signs. Now, if we're talking about those who are on the federal side of it, who are not in these quote unquote safety sensitive positions like our federal government, what I call the testing designated positions, now we're concerned with relationship problems, economic, educational, not the best educational outcomes, lower career achievements, and reduced life satisfaction. So now these are the individuals who hold top secret clearances and
Did you just
things
say
of
top?
that nature.
You just said top secret clearances.
Yeah, these are on the federal side.
Oh,
So there's a whole new world of things out there that we all have to take into consideration. So again, it's not just about our testing designated positions, but other things and other people in positions can be affected by the side effects of this drug, because most of them are pushing the issue because of the medical side, but there still are other adverse outcomes, to these things. There's always the yin and the yang, right?
Yeah. So right now, we are coming up on a November election. How could that potentially impact this process? Because if I recall, when it came out, they really didn't say when it would end. They said, we are going to go through this process. And Mark, you laid out all the steps, but it didn't really have a timeline other than the deadline yesterday, right, for public comment. So will the presidential election impact this at all?
I truly believe it will, because I think that one of the things that we all clearly need to understand is that there's the process that's in place is not something that just happens overnight. And so it takes a very long time. I go back to looking at previous rulemakings that occurred and the number of years that it took. Okay. Such as, one of the things that I always look at is oral fluid drug testing was something that the Department of Transportation finally made a decision to go ahead and sign off and say it was going to be allowed as another testing mechanism. Mm-hmm. And it took, I can't quote the exact number of years, but it took several years, and we have still not have it implemented today. Wow. It's still not implemented. It's effective and it's become final rule, and it's there as of last year. But unfortunately, the processes that it takes to be able to implement things. So I think that, this reclassification process now may become stalled. Oh. And could potentially, depending on the outcome of our election, totally take a totally different direction. And so I think that we are in a almost holding pattern in that we're going to continue to have the process go forward. However, we can't rule out that this could all of a sudden get stalled, get rewritten, get totally changed, mm-hmm. and it could totally look differently come November.
Greg, you want to add to that?
No, I agree with everything he said. I think that we're going to go into a stall just like the government does every year around October, because that's the government's fiscal year ending, mm-hmm. right? October becomes 2025 for the federal government, and everything comes to a complete halt. So just like this ruling and everything else, depends on, a change in administration. You have different viewpoints. You're going to end up with a different head of DOJ. All these other entities there, if that is a changeover, all of these presidential appointees get appointed out and new mindset comes in and new things. And then, let's say that this isn't their priority and they moving into other things. This could just sit there, until next administration changeover. Who knows? Just depends. So we just have to wait.
And isn't this the first time that the federal government has said that they wanted to reclassify cannabis? Has this ever happened before, or is this the first time?
I think that going back to 2009, that they've always been trying to reschedule drugs. This isn't the first. Right. It just becomes.
But marijuana, though.
Marijuana is popular.
Is this the first time they've ever tried to?
Some people have said this is the first time in over 50 years.
Yeah.
That that this is a different, and there's also people that speculate that this is the first step in potentially full legalization of cannabis. Mm. So it's a stepping stone, if you will. And so I think that, there's the need for conversation, the need for inclusion and including people is so important. It's so important to visit with your Congress people, your senators, your legislative people. Make sure that you're part of the conversation and you're not left behind. I think that's what's so important today.
Yeah. And actually, we have a Melissa who's listening on YouTube. And actually, I think you just answered her question. How can one participate in policymaking or research studies?
Absolutely. And I can't say enough, get with your legislative people, contact your legislative individuals within your state, within your district. You're one of their constituents and they will listen. You just need to reach out to them and ask that you be part of, and you can be part of the actual conversation, but also reach out to the scientific community. That's where the research is happening. And if you have the expertise in that area and the degree in that area and you can be of assistance, they would love to hear from you. Because again, I can't say enough, we're stronger together. And if we unite, we have the ability to bring about change. But we all have to just be part of the actual conversation and be open-minded.
Yeah. Thank you for that closing comment, Mark. Greg, I want to give you an opportunity to share any closing comments before we wrap up the conversation today.
I just want to kind of piggyback off what Mark said. I think that if I was to leave thought with anybody is get educated. Get out there and get educated on, the whole process in itself. You have to step outside of your own personal, world and just look at things from a non-objective standpoint and just kind of get educated and reach out, But if you're going to reach out, come with a solution instead of just always having a problem or, something negative, come with some mindset to help make change, for whatever that is.
Yeah. Well, this was a really, really educational and informative conversation. So Mark and Greg, I want to thank you both for being guests on this Conversations on Cannabis virtual forum, brought to you by the Medical Marijuana Education and Research Initiative at Florida A&M University. Thank you to everyone watching this program. Tell us what you think about this forum by completing the survey posted in the comment boxes on YouTube and Facebook after this live program. If you complete the survey, your name will be entered into a drawing on August 6, 2024 to win a $100 gift card provided by one of Mary's partners. We also want to encourage you to go to the Florida Department of Health Office of Medical Marijuana Use website to learn how to obtain a legal medical marijuana card in the state of Florida. We also encourage you to go to Florida A&M University's Mary website to learn more about this initiative, its educational programs, and additional information about cannabis use in Florida. Thanks, everyone.